The waist gunner's position in a B-24 Liberator wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't built for safety. And on December 20th, 1943, when Staff Sergeant Michael Arruth stood behind his twin .50 calibers at 27,000 feet over Bremen, Germany, it wasn't built for what he was about to do. Within 11 minutes, he would defy every tactical doctrine the Army Air Forces had written, ignore direct orders from his aircraft commander, and execute a firing solution so reckless that 3 crew members would later testify they thought he'd lost his mind. 9 German fighters would fall from the sky, and the legend of the gunner who aimed where death lived would begin. December 1943. The 8th Air Force called it the Bloody Winter. German fighter defenses had evolved into a killing machine so efficient that bomber crews measured survival in missions, not months. The average life expectancy for a B-24 crew over Germany was 15 combat sorties. Arruth was on his 23rd. His bomber, a battle-scarred Liberator named Devil's Daughter, belonged to the 392nd Bomb Group, and on this morning, she was one of 500 bombers tasked with destroying the Focke-Wulf aircraft manufacturing plants in Bremen. Intelligence promised heavy resistance. They weren't exaggerating. Arruth had grown up in Pennsylvania coal country, where you learned early that hesitation killed just as surely as carelessness. He'd enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, spent 8 months in gunnery school, and arrived in England with a reputation for unorthodox thinking that made officers nervous. His philosophy was simple and completely contrary to training. Don't shoot where the fighter is, and don't shoot where the fighter is going. Shoot where the fighter has to go to kill you. It was a subtle distinction that most gunners never grasped. Arruth had built his entire defensive strategy around it. The formation crossed the enemy coast at 09:47 hours. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Bf-109s and FW-190s, more than 100 fighters coordinated in waves, executing the brutal head-on attacks that had turned the previous month's missions into funeral processions. The German pilots had learned that a B-24's nose was its weakest point. They came in fast, 12 o'clock level, firing their 20mm cannons in short, devastating bursts before breaking away beneath the bomber's stream. Most engagements lasted 3 seconds. Most American gunners never got a shot off. Arruth watched the first wave develop. 6 Messerschmitts, line abreast formation, coming straight at the lead element. His position in the waist gave him limited forward visibility, but he'd spent months studying attack patterns, memorizing the rhythms of German tactics. He knew what was coming next. As the first wave broke away, diving beneath the formation, the second wave would swing wide, looking for damaged stragglers. That's where waist gunners earned their pay. That's where Arruth lived. The lead bomber, 300 yards ahead, took cannon fire through the nose. The plexiglass shattered in a spray of fragments. The aircraft held formation for perhaps 5 seconds, then nosed over into a dive that would end 40,000 feet below in a frozen German field. No parachutes. Arruth had seen it 11 times before. He'd stopped counting after that. Fighters, 3 o'clock high. The radio call came from the top turret gunner, a kid from Iowa named Patterson who'd been in combat for exactly 4 missions. His voice carried the edge of panic that separated new crews from veteran crews. Arruth didn't respond. He was already tracking. 3 FW-190s peeling off from altitude, setting up for a beam attack. Standard doctrine said to lead the target, to put your stream of fire ahead of the fighter's flight path, and let him fly into it. Arruth had tried that method on his first 5 missions. His hit rate had been roughly 8%. Unacceptable. So he'd started experimenting. Started watching not just where the fighters went, but why they went there. He'd noticed something the training manuals never mentioned. German pilots weren't suicidal. They wanted to kill bombers, but they wanted to survive the encounter, which meant they flew predictable evasion patterns after their firing pass. The first 190 opened fire at 800 yards. Arruth didn't return fire. He watched. The fighter's cannon flickered, tracers arcing across the winter sky, impacting the bomber 2 positions back. The 190 held his attack run until 400 yards, then broke hard left and down. Textbook. The second fighter followed the same pattern, same break, same direction. Also textbook. The third fighter began his run. Arruth swung his twin .50s 30 degrees left of the fighter's nose. He wasn't aiming at the aircraft. He was aiming at empty sky. His thumbs settled on the triggers. He waited. The 190 fired, held, and at exactly 400 yards, broke left and down, directly into Arruth's sustained burst. 50 caliber rounds impacted the fighter's engine cowling at the rate of 800 rounds per minute. The 190's prop flew apart. Smoke poured from the engine. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing fire. Holy Mary, Mother of God. The intercom crackled with Patterson's voice. "Did you just stay on your sector?" Aruth cut him off. There wasn't time for commentary. The German formation was reorganizing for another pass. What happened in the next 9 minutes would later be analyzed by Army Air Force's tacticians, dissected by gunnery instructors, and debated by historians for decades. Because Aruth didn't just repeat his technique, he refined it, adapted it, turned it into something that looked less like defensive gunnery and more like predictive ambush. The second wave came in from 5 o'clock, 4 fighters in a loose finger-4 formation. Aruth tracked the leader, calculated the breakpoint, and fired into empty air 40 degrees ahead of where any rational gunner would aim. The leader flew directly into the stream and took rounds through the cockpit. The fighter snapped into a vertical climb, stalled, and entered a flat spin. Aruth shifted to the number 2 fighter, repeated the process, and watched the 109 shed its left wing at 3,000 feet per second. The number 3 fighter saw what was happening and broke early, trying to spoil Aruth's firing solution. It didn't matter. Aruth had already anticipated the evasion. He'd fired into the space where an early break would take the aircraft. The 109 flew through a curtain of .50 caliber fire and simply disintegrated, the empennage separating from the fuselage in a spray of aluminum fragments. The 4th fighter didn't attack. He reversed hard, dove away, and disappeared into the cloud layer below. Self-preservation had overridden orders. Aruth didn't blame him. "Aruth, what the hell are you doing?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Hendricks, the aircraft commander, a 24-year-old pilot from Michigan who'd been flying combat missions since August. "You're firing blind! You're wasting ammunition!" Aruth didn't answer immediately. He was tracking another formation, 6 fighters setting up for a climbing attack from below. The B-24's ball turret was engaging, tracer fire stitching patterns against the blue winter sky, but the angle was wrong. The fighters would come up through the formation's blind spot, the gap between the ball turret's maximum elevation and the waist gun's minimum depression. It was a gap German pilots exploited ruthlessly. "Negative, sir," Aruth finally responded. "I'm not wasting anything." The first fighter of the new wave emerged from below, climbing at 60 degrees, cannon blazing. The bomber to Devil's Daughter's left took hits in the number 3 engine. The prop windmilled twice and froze. The bomber held position. The fighter continued his climb, arcing over the top of his parabola, preparing to roll inverted and dive away. Aruth put a 3-second burst exactly where the fighter would be when he completed his roll. The 109 flew through it nose first. The canopy shattered. The fighter pitched forward into an uncontrolled tumble. The second fighter saw his leader die and adjusted, rolling out early, trying to reverse away from whatever invisible death had claimed his wingman. Aruth had already calculated that response. His guns were waiting. The fighter took rounds through the fuel tank behind the cockpit. The 109 didn't explode. It simply came apart, structural failure propagating from the point of impact until nothing remained but falling debris. 6 fighters down. 5 minutes elapsed. "Lieutenant, I need you to hold this heading for 90 more seconds." Aruth's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Don't deviate, don't jink, just hold it steady." "Are you out of your mind?" Hendricks shot back. "We're the only bomber holding formation on the far right. We're exposed. I know what we are, sir. I need 90 seconds." The next wave was already forming up, and Aruth had recognized something the rest of the formation hadn't. The German controller was adapting, pulling fighters away from the main bomber stream and concentrating them on isolated targets. Devil's Daughter, holding position on the far edge of the formation, was about to receive the full attention of at least 8 fighters. It was a death sentence by any conventional analysis. Aruth saw it as an opportunity. The attacks came from 3 directions simultaneously: 2 fighters from 11 o'clock high, 3 from 3 o'clock level, and 3 more from 7 o'clock low. It was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm defensive fire, to force gunners to choose targets and leave gaps in coverage. Most bombers would take catastrophic damage from at least one element of the attack. Aruth chose all of them. His guns traversed left, engaging the high attack first. He didn't aim at the fighters. He aimed at the convergence point, the spot where both aircraft would have to pass to avoid colliding with each other after their firing run. He fired a 4-second burst into empty sky. The lead fighter flew through it and nosed down, smoke pouring from the engine. The wingman, focused on his own attack run, didn't see the debris field until too late. He clipped his leader's tail section with his left wing. Both aircraft fell away in tangled wreckage. Aruth shifted right. The beam attack was developing, 3 190s in trail formation, each preparing to fire in sequence. He calculated their spacing, their breakpoints, and the limitations of their attack geometry. Then he did something that violated every principle of defensive gunnery. He stopped firing. The silence confused the German pilots. They'd been trained to track tracer fire, to identify active defensive positions and adjust their attacks accordingly. Arruth's guns were cold. The fighters committed to their runs, each aircraft following the same track, each pilot assuming the waist position was unmanned or destroyed. At precisely 300 yards, Arruth opened fire. Not at the fighters, but at the space between them, the air they'd have to fly through to reach their breakpoints. The first 190 flew into the stream and took rounds through the wing route. The wing folded upward, failed, and separated. The fighter cartwheeled into the number 2 aircraft, which had nowhere to go, no time to react. Both fighters merged into a single fireball that fell through the formation trailing black smoke. The third fighter broke hard, panicked, and flew directly into fire from the ball turret. 3 guns, 3 different shooters, perfect coordination achieved through pure chance. The 190 came apart. The low attack never materialized. The remaining German fighters broke off, refusing to press their runs. They'd watched 8 of their squadron die in less than 60 seconds, killed by a single gunner who seemed to know where they'd be before they knew themselves. Self-preservation overrode orders. The formation scattered. "Cease fire." Hendricks' voice on the intercom was quiet, almost reverent. "Arruth, you still with us?" "Yes, sir." Arruth stepped back from his guns. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline finally breaking through his combat focus. The barrel shrouds glowed cherry red. Spent brass casings covered the floor, ankle deep, still hot enough to burn through flight suits. The smell of cordite was overwhelming, a chemical stink that would linger in the aircraft for days. "Did I just watch what I think I watched?" Hendricks asked. Arruth looked out at the sky. 9 smoke trails marked the passage of German fighters that would never return home. 9 pilots who'd woken up that morning, eaten breakfast, kissed photographs of wives or girlfriends, and climbed into their aircraft believing they'd survive the day. War didn't care about belief. It cared about mathematics, geometry, and the split-second decisions that separated life from death. "I shot where they had to be, sir," Arruth said quietly, "not where they were." The formation continued east, hit the target, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. Devil's Daughter landed at her base in England at 14:47 hours, with 1,400 pounds of ammunition expended, 17 holes in her fuselage from German cannon fire, and 1 waist gunner who'd rewritten the tactical manual in 11 minutes over Germany. The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Intelligence officers questioned every crew member, cross-referenced their accounts, and reviewed the gun camera footage 3 times. Patterson, the top turret gunner, was adamant. He was firing at ghosts, at nothing, and then the fighters would just fly into it and die. "I've never seen anything like it." The bombardier, a former mathematics teacher from Boston named Kowalski, offered his analysis. He was calculating intercept geometry in real time, factoring in fighter speed, brake patterns, and evasion responses. He turned defense into offense. It shouldn't be possible, but I watched it happen. Lieutenant Hendricks was more direct. "If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd call everyone in this room a liar. Arruth didn't just engage those fighters, he hunted them. And when this war is over, someone needs to teach every gunner in this Air Force how he did it." The Army Air Forces tried. Arruth spent 3 weeks after the mission working with gunnery instructors, breaking down his technique, explaining his thought process. But what worked for him didn't translate to other gunners. His method required an intuitive understanding of 3-dimensional geometry, an ability to predict human behavior under stress, and a willingness to fire at targets that didn't exist yet. Most gunners couldn't master one element. Arruth had synthesized all 3. He flew 17 more missions. His confirmed kill count reached 22 fighters, the highest total for any B-24 waist gunner in the European theater. He survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, and never spoke publicly about what happened over Bremen. When historians found him in 1967 and asked him to explain his technique, he gave them the same answer he'd given his aircraft commander 24 years earlier. "You don't shoot where they are. You don't shoot where they're going. You shoot where they have to be to survive. And if you're right, they fly into your fire. If you're wrong, you're the one who doesn't make it home." It's not complicated. It's just math and terror and luck. And on that day over Bremen, the math worked. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The footage exists because it had to. When Arruth returned from the Bremen mission, his aircraft commander filed a report so extraordinary that headquarters initially rejected it as either exaggerated or fabricated. Gunners didn't achieve 9 kills in a single mission. The statistical probability approached 0. But the gun camera footage told a different story. and within 48 hours, officers from 8th Air Force Headquarters were reviewing the film frame by frame, trying to understand what they were seeing. The quality was poor by modern standards. The 16mm cameras mounted in bomber gun positions captured images in harsh black and white, the frames jumping and stuttering as the aircraft vibrated through flak and evasive maneuvers. But the sequence was unmistakable. Fighter after fighter, flying into streams of tracer fire that appeared to materialize from empty sky, disintegrating in microseconds of contact. The timing was so precise that some analysts initially suspected the footage had been doctored. It hadn't been. What they were watching was simply the result of a 23-year-old gunner who'd learned to think 4 seconds ahead of everyone trying to kill him. The military classification on the footage remained in effect until 1973. By then, the tactical innovation had become irrelevant. Jet fighters and guided missiles had rendered the entire concept of manned defensive gunnery obsolete. But the principle Aruth had demonstrated, the idea of predictive engagement, would resurface in air combat doctrine, electronic warfare, and eventually in the algorithms that governed modern missile defense systems. He never knew that his 11 minutes over Bremen had influenced generations of tactical thinking. He didn't care. For Aruth, the mission had never been about innovation. It had been about survival. The crew of Devil's Daughter flew together for 4 more months. In April 1944, over Brunswick, they took flak through the No. 2 engine during the bomb run. The engine exploded, shrapnel penetrated the flight deck, and Lieutenant Hendricks took fragments through his right arm and shoulder. The co-pilot, a replacement officer on his second mission, froze at the controls. The bomber began a shallow dive, falling out of formation, losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. Without intervention, they had perhaps 90 seconds before the dive became unrecoverable. Aruth left his gun position, moved forward through the bomb bay, and climbed into the cockpit. He had no pilot training. He'd never touched the controls of a B-24, but he'd spent 27 missions watching his aircraft commanders fly, and he understood the basic principle: pull back to climb, push forward to dive, wings level to fly straight. He grabbed the co-pilot's yoke, hauled back with everything he had, and felt the bomber shudder as it responded. The nose came up. The dive arrested. Hendricks, bleeding and barely conscious, talked him through the next 10 minutes until they reached friendly airspace and a fighter escort could vector them toward the nearest emergency field. They landed at a Royal Air Force base in Norfolk with hydraulics failing, 1 engine gone, and fuel reserves measured in minutes. Aruth kept the wings level all the way to touchdown. The landing was hard enough to blow both main gear tires, but everyone walked away. Hendricks survived his wounds, returned to the States for recovery, and wrote a letter to Army Air Forces headquarters recommending Aruth for the Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation was approved. The medal was presented in a ceremony Aruth didn't attend. He was flying another mission when they held the event. The statistics from the 8th Air Force bomber campaign tell a story of attrition that defies easy comprehension. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States sent more than 26,000 heavy bombers against targets in occupied Europe and Germany. Roughly 47,000 American airmen died in those aircraft. The casualty rate exceeded 50% for crews who flew full 25 mission tours. And yet they kept flying, kept climbing into those aluminum coffins at dawn, knowing the mathematics of survival argued against their return. Aruth completed 40 missions. The official requirement was 25, but he volunteered for a second tour when the Army Air Forces changed crew rotation policies in late 1944. His reasoning was characteristically blunt. I know how to stay alive up there. Most of the replacements don't. If I can teach a few of them before they get killed, it's worth another 15 missions. He didn't teach them gunnery technique. That was too individualized, too dependent on factors that couldn't be transferred. Instead, he taught them situational awareness, how to read a formation, how to identify the weak points where German fighters would concentrate their attacks, how to recognize when a fighter's approach looked wrong, when the geometry suggested something other than a standard attack run, how to survive the 3 seconds between when you saw the fighter and when the fighter saw you. Some of them learned. Most didn't live long enough. The casualty rates for replacement crews remained brutally high throughout 1944, even as Allied air superiority reduced the frequency of German fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe might have been dying, but it was dying hard, and the fighters that remained were flown by the survivors. The pilots who'd learned their trade in the killing skies over Germany and knew every trick, every tactic that might keep them alive one more day. Aruth's 40th and final mission was flown on April 25, 1945, 11 days before Germany surrendered. The target was an ammunition depot near Salzburg, Austria, a mission briefed as routine. There was no significant flak, no fighter opposition, no mechanical problems. Devil's Daughter dropped her bombs, turned for home, and landed at base without incident. Aruth climbed out of the aircraft, removed his flight gear, and walked away from combat flying without ceremony or fanfare. He'd survived what most men hadn't. There was nothing else to say. The Army Air Forces offered him a promotion and a position as a gunnery instructor. He declined both. He requested discharge, received it within 30 days, and returned to Pennsylvania in June 1945. He took a job in the coal mines, married a woman named Eleanor who'd grown up 3 streets away from his childhood home, and spent the next 43 years living a life so deliberately unremarkable that neighbors who'd known him for decades never learned he'd been in the war. There was one exception. In 1967, a historian researching 8th Air Force gunnery tactics tracked Aruth down through military records and requested an interview. Aruth agreed, on the condition that the interview be conducted at his home, that no photographs be taken, and that his current life not be discussed. The historian agreed. The resulting transcript ran to 47 single-spaced pages and became one of the foundational documents for understanding defensive air combat in World War II. Most of the interview focused on technical details, fighter approach angles, gunnery lead calculations, the physical limitations of the K-5 gun sight, but toward the end, the historian asked a question that cut through the technical analysis. Did you ever feel like you were taking lives? Or did it feel like you were saving them? Aruth's response was recorded verbatim. Every time I pulled those triggers, I knew what I was doing. I was killing someone. A German pilot with a family, with friends, with a life he wanted to get back to. Same as me. Same as everyone in that bomber. The difference was, if I didn't kill him first, he was going to kill 10 men in my aircraft. Maybe 50 men in the bombers around us. So I made the choice. I aimed, I fired, and I lived with it. Still do. Every single day. You want to know if it bothers me? Of course it bothers me. But not as much as it would bother me if I'd let my crew die because I hesitated. That's the trade. That's what we did up there. We made impossible choices in 3-second windows and lived with the consequences for the rest of our lives. The interview ended shortly after. The historian thanked Aruth for his time, drove back to his university, and never contacted him again. The transcript was filed in an archive, read by perhaps 50 people over the next 30 years, and largely forgotten until military historians began digitizing World War II oral histories in the 1990s. By then, Aruth had been dead for 3 years. He died in 1988 at the age of 67 from complications related to black lung disease contracted during his years in the mines. Eleanor was with him at the end. So were his 3 children, none of whom had known the full extent of their father's war record until after his death, when a box of documents arrived from the National Archives in response to a Freedom of Information Act request they'd filed. The box contained his service records, copies of commendation letters, the transcript of the 1967 interview, and a single photograph taken at the medal ceremony he'd skipped in 1944. Someone had pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his empty dress uniform and photographed it anyway, a ghost tribute to a man who'd refused to celebrate killing. His children donated the materials to the National Museum of the Air Force. They remain there today, part of a permanent exhibit on bomber defensive tactics. The exhibit includes the gun camera footage from the Bremen mission, digitally restored and slowed to half speed so visitors can track the fighter intercepts frame by frame. A placard explains the technique, breaks down the mathematics, and notes that no other gunner in the war achieved comparable results using similar methods. The exhibit doesn't explain why. Some things can't be reduced to placards. The men who flew with Aruth understood. Patterson, the top turret gunner, survived the war and kept in contact with Aruth until the early 1970s. In a letter written in 1972, he tried to articulate what it had been like to fly with someone who operated on a different level of combat awareness. You'd be up there, scared out of your mind, watching fighters come in, knowing you were probably about to die, and then you'd hear Mike's guns open up. Not at the fighters, at nothing, just empty sky, and you'd think he'd lost it. Then the fighters would hit that empty sky and just explode, and you'd realize he'd seen something you hadn't. He was fighting a battle 3 seconds in the future while the rest of us were trying to survive the present. I flew 31 missions. I survived because of a lot of things. Luck, good pilots, good crews, but mostly I survived because Mike Aruth could shoot at ghosts and kill them before they became real. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The question that haunted analysts for decades was whether Aruth's technique could have been taught systematically. The Army Air Forces certainly tried, After the Bremen mission, gunnery schools added modules on predictive engagement, on calculating intercept geometry, on reading fighter behavior patterns. Success rates improved marginally, but the improvement was measured in percentage points, not the magnitude of difference Ruth represented. The consensus emerged that what he'd done was less a technique than an innate capability, something that combined spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and combat intuition in ways that couldn't be reduced to a training curriculum. Modern researchers, examining the same data with computational tools, reached a different conclusion. They built simulations of the Bremen engagement, fed in the variables Ruth would have had available, and ran probability models of his firing solutions. The results suggested he wasn't operating on intuition alone. He was executing a form of rapid probabilistic calculation, weighing multiple variables simultaneously and selecting firing solutions that maximized hit probability within the constraints of human reaction time and mechanical limitations. It was a cognitive process that modern fighter pilots would recognize as similar to what they do when employing beyond visual range weapon systems. Ruth was doing it manually, at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, with weapons designed for direct engagement. The simulation also revealed something the analyst hadn't fully appreciated. Ruth's technique worked because he'd accepted a fundamental truth most gunners refused to acknowledge. Defensive fire wasn't about deterrence, it was about killing. German fighters attacking bombers weren't testing defenses or probing for weakness. They were committed to their attack runs, locked into engagement geometry that limited their options. Once a fighter pilot committed to an attack vector, physics and human limitations constrained where he could go next. Ruth had learned to read those constraints and exploit them. He didn't fire to scare fighters away. He fired to create unavoidable kill zones that fighters flew into because they had nowhere else to go. It was ruthlessly efficient. It was mathematically elegant, and it required a willingness to accept that every trigger pull was an attempt to kill another human being. Most gunners couldn't maintain that mindset. They fired to defend, to survive, to protect their crew. Ruth fired to kill because he understood that anything less than maximum lethality increased the probability that his crew would die. It was a subtle psychological difference that produced dramatically different tactical outcomes. The psychological cost of that mindset was something Ruth never discussed publicly. But Eleanor, his wife, saw it in the way he'd wake up at night, the way he'd sometimes stare at nothing for minutes at a time, the way he'd tense whenever he heard aircraft engines overhead. She knew something had broken in him during the war, something that never fully healed. He functioned, he worked, he raised his children, and lived what appeared to be a normal life. But there was a distance to him, a separation between who he was and who he'd had to become to survive those missions over Germany. In a letter to Patterson written in 1978, Eleanor tried to articulate what she'd observed. Mike doesn't talk about the war, not to me, not to anyone. But sometimes, when he thinks I'm not watching, I see him counting on his fingers, moving them like he's calculating something. I asked him about it once, just once. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, and he said, "I'm making sure I remember all of them, every single one, because if I forget even one, it means I've let myself off the hook." I didn't ask again, but I see him counting, even now, 30 years later, 22 times. That's how many fighters he told the Air Force he shot down, 22 men he killed. And he counts them every few weeks, making sure he hasn't lost track, making sure he remembers what he did to come home. The letter was discovered among Patterson's effects after his death in 1991. It was never published, never shared with historians. It remains in private hands, part of a collection of correspondence that Patterson's family has declined to donate to any archive. Some stories, they decided, were too personal to be history. The broader legacy of Ruth's service isn't found in archives or museums. It's found in the operational evolution of air combat tactics. The principle he demonstrated, that defensive systems could be employed offensively through predictive engagement, influenced how the military thought about air-to-air combat in the jet age. The concept of creating kill zones based on predicted enemy movement rather than current position became foundational to beyond visual range missile employment. The idea that defenders could seize initiative through superior situation awareness and firing discipline became central to counter-air doctrine. None of those doctrinal documents mention Ruth by name. Military doctrine doesn't evolve through individual attribution. It evolves through accumulated lessons, analyzed failures, and successful techniques that get absorbed into institutional knowledge. But the lineage is traceable. The gunnery reports from 1944, the post-war tactical studies, the early Jet Age combat analysis, they all reference the Bremen technique, or predictive defensive engagement, as proven concepts worth developing. They're referencing what one gunner did in 11 minutes when he decided the rules didn't apply to him anymore. The irony is that Aruth never thought he was inventing anything. In his mind, he was simply solving a problem using available tools and clear thinking. The enemy fighters had to behave in certain ways because physics and human limitations dictated those behaviors. He calculated where those behaviors would take them, positioned his fire accordingly, and let the fighters destroy themselves through their own tactical choices. It wasn't genius, it was geometry. The fact that no one else seemed to think that way wasn't his concern, but it was remarkable. 26,000 heavy bombers flew combat missions over Europe. Those bombers carried somewhere north of 250,000 gunners during the course of the war. Thousands of those gunners became aces, achieving 5 or more confirmed kills. Fewer than 100 achieved double-digit kill counts, and only one achieved 9 kills in a single mission, through a technique so unorthodox that observers initially thought he was malfunctioning. The veterans who knew him had a different perspective. They understood that what looked like genius to outsiders was actually desperation refined through repetition. Aruth had survived 23 missions before Bremen by learning to read patterns, by watching how fighters attacked and how they died, by cataloging in his mind the split-second decisions that separated successful defense from catastrophic failure. What he did over Bremen wasn't inspiration. It was the accumulated knowledge of 23 missions compressed into 11 minutes of perfect execution. Genius looks effortless because you don't see the preceding hours of terror that taught the genius what to do. Lieutenant Hendricks, in his final interview before his death in 2003, put it most succinctly, "People ask me if Mike was brave, if he was some kind of superhuman warrior. He wasn't. He was terrified. Every single mission. I could see it in his hands before we took off, the way they'd shake while he was loading ammunition. But he'd done the work. He'd learned the patterns. And when the fighters came, the fear got pushed aside by the math. He knew what to do because he'd figured it out over 23 previous missions where he'd been just as scared, but had to learn or die. Bremen wasn't the day he became a genius. It was the day all those previous lessons aligned perfectly, and 9 German pilots paid the price for his education. That perspective, the understanding that exceptional performance in combat is usually the product of accumulated experience rather than innate superiority, was something the veterans understood but historians often missed. The narratives that emerged from World War II tended to lionize individuals, to create heroic figures whose actions seemed to transcend normal human capability. The reality was more prosaic and somehow more impressive. Men like Aruth succeeded because they learned faster than their enemies killed them. Every mission was a lesson. Every mistake that didn't prove fatal was knowledge that might prevent the next mistake from being fatal. Survival wasn't about courage or superhuman ability. It was about learning curves, and whether you lived long enough to reach the steep part of the curve where understanding started to outpace danger. Aruth reached that point somewhere around his 15th mission. The 15 missions after that were him applying what he'd learned, refining his technique, and surviving situations that would have killed him 3 months earlier. Bremen was simply the mission where everything came together, where the fighter attacks developed in a pattern he'd seen before and could exploit completely. It looked miraculous to observers. To Aruth, it was Tuesday over Germany, another day of math and terror and luck. Except this time, the math worked better than usual. The question that remains is whether others could have learned to do what he did. The Army Air Forces believed the answer was yes, that with proper training and selection, they could create more gunners capable of that level of performance. Post-war analysis suggested they were probably wrong. The combination of cognitive abilities, psychological temperament, and experiential learning that Aruth represented wasn't something that could be mass-produced through training programs. You could teach the basics, you could improve average performance, but you couldn't create another Aruth without putting hundreds of men through the same crucible of repeated combat exposure and hoping a few survived long enough to reach his level of capability. The military tried anyway. Gunnery training programs in late 1944 and 1945 incorporated lessons from Aruth's missions. Success rates improved, kill ratios got better, but the improvement was incremental, not revolutionary. The majority of gunners remained average, a minority became good, and a tiny fraction, the survivors who flew enough missions to internalize the patterns, became exceptional. That distribution wasn't something training could change. It was simply how human capability distributed itself under the stress of combat. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. After the war, when the military conducted its comprehensive analysis of air combat effectiveness, Aruth's missions were studied extensively, not because they represented typical performance, they didn't, but because they represented the theoretical ceiling of what was achieved. Continue R9, 18 able within the constraints of existing technology and human capability. If you wanted to know how effective a waist gunner could possibly be, you studied Aruth. If you wanted to know what average gunners should be trained to do, you studied someone else. The distinction was important. Military training programs are designed around average performance, not exceptional performance. You can't build a doctrine around outliers because outliers aren't reproducible. What you can do is identify what made the outliers successful and try to incorporate those elements into general training in ways that lift average performance. That's what the Army Air Forces did with Aruth's technique. They didn't try to make every gunner into Aruth. They tried to make every gunner slightly better by teaching them to think about predictive engagement instead of reactive defense. The results were mixed but positive. Post-training analysis showed that gunners who received the updated curriculum had higher hit rates and better survival rates than gunners trained under the old system. The improvement was measured in percentage points. But percentage points matter when you're talking about thousands of combat missions. If the new training saved one bomber crew out of every 100 missions, that was hundreds of lives over the course of the war. It wasn't revolutionary, but in a war of attrition, incremental improvements accumulated into strategic advantage. Aruth never knew about most of this. He left the military in 1945 and never looked back. The fact that his technique had been absorbed into training doctrine, that thousands of gunners had been taught modified versions of his methods, that his 11 minutes over Bremen had influenced how the military thought about air defense, none of that reached him. He lived his life in Pennsylvania, worked in the mines, raised his family, and died without knowing that his legacy extended far beyond his own survival. It's tempting to wonder what he would have thought if he'd known. Would it have mattered to him that his combat experience had been transformed into doctrine? That his individual success had been systematized and taught to others? The available evidence suggests probably not. In the 1967 interview, when the historian asked him how he felt about his combat record, Aruth's response was blunt. "I'm alive. My crew survived. That's all that mattered. Everything else is just paperwork." That perspective, the reduction of combat to its essential truth, survival, was characteristic of how many veterans approached their wartime experience. The medals, the commendations, the historical significance, none of that mattered as much as the fundamental fact of coming home. Aruth shot down 22 fighters, not because he wanted to be an ace or because he sought recognition. He did it because fighters that weren't shot down killed bombers, and he was in one of those bombers. The motivation was survival, and everything else was incidental. The men who flew with him understood that completely. In the letters and interviews they gave over the decades, they consistently described him not as a hero, but as a survivor who'd learned how to keep everyone around him alive, too. Patterson's description was typical. Mike didn't talk about courage or duty or any of that. He talked about geometry and timing and not dying, and he was really, really good at not dying, which meant the rest of us got to not die too. That's what made him special, not the kills. The fact that we all came home, all except one. The tail gunner on Devil's Daughter, a kid named Roberts from Tennessee, didn't survive the war. He transferred to another crew in March 1944, completed 8 missions with his new assignment, and died over Berlin when his bomber took a direct flak hit and exploded before anyone could bail out. Aruth learned about it a week after it happened. He didn't talk about it, didn't discuss how he felt. But Eleanor remembered that he went quiet for several days, that he'd sit at the kitchen table after work and just stare at nothing. When she asked if he was all right, he said, "I taught him everything I knew, and it didn't matter. He's still dead." The randomness of survival was something that haunted many veterans. You could do everything right, follow every procedure, execute perfect technique, and still die because a shell fragment hit your aircraft at exactly the wrong angle. Conversely, you could make mistakes, violate doctrine, do everything wrong, and survive because luck fell your way that day. The lack of correlation between performance and outcome was maddening for men who'd spent the war trying to find patterns, trying to create control in an environment defined by chaos. Aruth's technique gave him more control than most. His ability to predict fighter movements, to create kill zones rather than react to threats, provided a marginal advantage that increased his survival probability. But marginal advantages weren't guarantees. They were just slightly better odds in a game where the house always won eventually. He'd gotten luckier than most. His odds had been better than most. But Roberts had been killed anyway. and all the technique in the world couldn't change that. The psychological weight of survivors' guilt was something the military didn't really address in the 1940s. Combat fatigue was recognized. Battle stress was understood. But the specific trauma of surviving when others didn't, of coming home when friends stayed in European soil, that wasn't something the veterans were given tools to process. Most of them buried it, carried it quietly, and dealt with it in private ways that their families saw but couldn't fully understand. Aruth carried it through counting. 22 kills meant 22 German pilots who didn't go home. He couldn't forget them because forgetting seemed like absolution he hadn't earned. Robert's death meant his technique hadn't been enough to save everyone. He couldn't forget that either because forgetting seemed like betrayal. So he counted regularly, a private ritual that kept both truths alive. He'd killed to survive, and survival hadn't saved everyone. Eleanor watched him count for 43 years. She never interrupted. She understood, without being told explicitly, that this was how he processed what couldn't be processed, how he carried what couldn't be forgotten. In her letter to Patterson, she noted that the counting became less frequent over the years, but never stopped completely. Even in his final weeks, dying from black lung disease in a Pennsylvania hospital, she saw his fingers move through the familiar pattern. 22. He died still counting. The children found the photograph after his death. It was tucked in a book, one of the few items he'd kept from his military service. The photo showed Devil's Daughter, the B-24 he'd flown 40 missions in, sitting on a hard stand in England. The crew was posed in front of the nose, 10 men in flight suits, young faces trying to look confident for the camera. Aruth was in the back row, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. Someone had written on the back, 392nd BG, March 1944, the only crew photo where everyone survived the war. That last sentence wasn't quite true. Roberts had survived when the photo was taken, but died a month later. Someone, probably Aruth, had added a notation in different ink. Almost everyone. Almost. That single word, almost, captured everything about his war experience. Almost perfect technique. Almost complete survival. Almost able to protect everyone. Almost enough. The photograph is now part of the Air Force Museum collection, displayed next to the gun camera footage and the service record. Visitors who read the exhibit materials learn about the Bremen mission, about the 22 kills, about the technique that influenced post-war doctrine. What they don't learn, because it's not in the official record, is about the counting, the guilt, the 43 years of carrying the weight of survival. That part of the story died with Aruth, or almost died. Eleanor's letter to Patterson preserved a fragment of it. Patterson's family, by keeping the letter private, ensured that fragment didn't become public spectacle. Some aspects of the veteran experience deserve protection from historical curiosity. The cost of survival isn't something that should be reduced to exhibit placards. The broader story, though, remains worth telling. Not because Aruth was unique, he wasn't, but because he represented something essential about the bomber war over Europe. Ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, finding ways to survive that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. Some of them survived through luck, some through skill, most through a combination of both. A very few, like Aruth, survived through a level of performance that seemed to transcend the normal distribution of human capability under stress. But even those exceptional performers were still fundamentally human. They felt fear, they made mistakes, they carried guilt, they counted their dead and wondered why they'd been the ones to make it home. The exceptional performance didn't make them superhuman. It just made their survival slightly more probable. Everything else, the trauma, the doubt, the psychological cost, was exactly the same as what every combat veteran carried. That's a story that often gets lost in histories focused on tactics and kill counts. The human cost of being effective in combat isn't just physical danger. It's the psychological weight of survival, of killing, of losing people you fought alongside. Aruth bore that weight for 43 years. The fact that he bore it quietly, without complaint or public display, doesn't make it less heavy. It just makes it less visible. The last recorded comment from Aruth about his war service came in 1985, 3 years before his death. A local newspaper, doing a Veterans Day feature, tracked him down and asked for an interview. He declined, but he did provide a written statement. It was 3 sentences long. I served. I survived. I remember them all. No elaboration, no context, just those 3 sentences, which captured everything and nothing about what he'd experienced. The newspaper ran it as part of a larger story about local veterans, and then Aruth disappeared back into private life. He'd said what needed to be said. Everything else was his to carry alone. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The technical legacy of Aruth's service extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. In the 1950s, when the Air Force began developing air-to-air missiles, weapons designers studied gunnery records from World War II to understand engagement geometry and hit probability. Aruth's missions appeared repeatedly in those studies, not as historical curiosities, but as data points that demonstrated what was achievable when engagement mechanics were optimized. The principle he'd employed, firing into predicted intercept points rather than tracking current position, became foundational to how missiles were designed to engage targets. The weapons were different, but the geometric principles were identical. By the 1960s, those principles had evolved into the beyond visual range engagement doctrine that defined Cold War air combat. Fighters no longer closed to gun range. They launched missiles from 20, 30, 40 miles away, targeting positions where enemy aircraft would be when the missiles arrived, not where they were when the missiles launched. It was predictive engagement scaled up to jet speeds and guided weapons. The cognitive process was the same one Aruth had executed manually over Bremen. Calculate where the target will be, position your weapon to intercept, execute. None of the weapons designers or doctrine writers knew they were refining concepts a B-24 waist gunner had demonstrated in 1943. The institutional knowledge had been absorbed and abstracted to the point where individual attribution disappeared. But the intellectual lineage was there, traceable through tactical studies and gunnery reports and post-war analysis documents. The idea that defensive weapons could be employed offensively through superior prediction of enemy movement, that came from somewhere. It came from men like Aruth, who'd figured it out when the alternative was dying. The irony is that the technology that made his technique obsolete, jet fighters, guided missiles, radar fire control, was developed using principles his technique had validated. Defensive gunnery on bombers disappeared because missiles could do the job better. But the missiles employed the same fundamental approach Aruth had used with mechanical guns and human calculation. Progress in weapons technology is often less about inventing new principles than about finding better ways to execute old ones. There's a deeper point worth considering. The bomber gunner represented a transitional moment in warfare, a brief period where individual skill could still influence outcomes in mechanized combat. Before World War II, aerial warfare was dominated by individual fighter pilots, whose personal capability directly determined survival. After World War II, technological systems increasingly mediated combat, reducing the role of individual human skill. Bomber gunners existed in the narrow gap between those eras, operating complex mechanical systems where human capability still mattered enormously, but was beginning to be supplemented and eventually replaced by automated systems. Aruth represented the peak of what was possible in that transitional moment. He took a mechanical system, the twin 50 caliber machine gun mount, and employed it at the theoretical maximum of human capability. His kill rate, his survival rate, his ability to read and predict complex tactical situations in real time, all of it pushed against the boundaries of what humans could do with the available technology. It was impressive precisely because it was at the edge of what was achievable, and everyone recognized that the edge was about to disappear as better technology arrived. The veterans understood this in ways historians sometimes missed. They knew they were operating in a dying tactical environment, that the kind of combat they were experiencing wouldn't exist in another decade. Patterson, in a 1978 interview, articulated it clearly. We were the last generation to fight that kind of war. Hand-aimed guns, visual sighting, human calculation. 10 years later, radar was doing everything we did, just faster and more accurate. We were obsolete before the war even ended. But for those few years, for those missions, what we did mattered. Our skill mattered. Mike's skill mattered. And then, technology moved on and made all of it irrelevant. That sense of fighting in a dying tactical environment gave the veterans' experience a particular poignancy. They knew, even as they fought, that they were part of a historical moment that wouldn't repeat. The specific combination of technology, tactics, and individual capability that defined their war wouldn't exist again. Future wars would be fought differently, with different tools, different tactics, different demands on human capability. What they learned, what they suffered through, what they survived, it was all specific to their historical moment, which makes preserving their stories more important, not less. Because while the specific tactics and technologies are obsolete, the fundamental human experience of combat transcends technological change. Fear, courage, loss, survival, guilt, trauma. Those aren't specific to any particular kind of warfare. They're universal across all combat, The veterans of the Bomber War experienced those things in a specific context, but what they learned about themselves and about human capability under extreme stress remains relevant regardless of how technology evolves. Aruth's story illustrates that perfectly. The tactical details, how he calculated firing solutions, how he read fighter movements, how he employed twin 50 caliber guns, those are historical curiosities now. But the broader themes, how exceptional performance comes from accumulated experience, how survival depends on learning faster than the enemy kills you, how the psychological cost of combat persists decades after the physical danger ends, those remain as relevant today as they were in 1943. That's why his children donated his papers to the museum, not to celebrate his kill count or to glorify combat, but to preserve a record of what one person experienced and how he carried it. The hope was that future generations, encountering very different forms of warfare with very different technologies, might still find something useful in the story of a coal miner's son who learned to survive in the skies over Germany and carried the cost of that survival for the rest of his life. The museum preserves the story faithfully. The gun camera footage, the service records, the interview transcripts, the photograph, all of it accessible to researchers and visitors. What it can't preserve is the experience itself, the visceral reality of standing behind those guns at 27,000 feet, watching fighters come in through the cold February air, making split-second calculations that determined whether you lived or died. That dies with the veterans. Each year, fewer of them remain. Soon, none will. But the stories remain. Imperfect records of experience that can't fully be conveyed but deserve the attempt anyway, because the alternative is forgetting, and forgetting dishonors both the dead and the survivors. The dead deserve to be remembered because they paid the ultimate price. The survivors deserve to be remembered because they paid a different price, one that extended across decades and shaped the rest of their lives in ways they rarely discussed but never escaped. Aruth paid that price. 22 kills over Germany. 40 missions survived, 43 years of counting, of carrying, of remembering. He did what needed to be done, learned to be exceptionally good at it, and lived with the consequences without complaint or expectation of recognition. That's the story. Not the 11 minutes of perfect execution over Bremen, but the decades that came after, when the missions were over but the war wasn't. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the final analysis, what made Aruth exceptional wasn't his skill with guns, though that was remarkable. It was his capacity to transform fear into focus, to convert the chaos of combat into manageable geometric problems, and to maintain that level of performance across 40 missions when most men broke well before that. The mental toughness required to sustain combat effectiveness over that many missions, over that many hours of mortal terror, is difficult to overstate. Every mission was another roll of the dice. Every mission was another test of whether fear would overwhelm function. Every mission was another opportunity for luck to run out. He passed every test. The dice kept falling his way. The fear never overwhelmed his function. And when his luck finally did run out, it was in a Pennsylvania coal mine 4 decades later, not in the sky over Germany. By any measure, he won. He survived. His crew survived. He came home. That was the only victory that mattered. But victory in war is always qualified by what it costs. Aruth paid in nightmares and guilt, and 43 years of counting. His family paid in living with someone who was present but distant, functional but damaged. The German pilots he killed paid with their lives. Their families paid with permanent loss. Roberts paid with his life in a different bomber, despite everything Aruth taught him. Victory doesn't mean absence of cost. It just means you survived to carry the cost. The men who served in bomber crews over Europe understood that completely. They'd all made the same bargain: risk everything for the possibility of survival. Some won the gamble, most didn't. The survivors carried guilt for beating odds that killed their friends. The moral mathematics of why one man lived and another died when both had the same training, the same courage, the same determination, defied explanation. Luck is a cruel arbitrator because it follows no logic, rewards no virtue, and answers to no sense of justice. Aruth was luckier than most. He was also more skilled than most. The combination kept him alive when either factor alone might not have been enough. But he understood, better than most, that the distinction between survivor and casualty was often vanishingly small. One small variation in any of 1,000 factors — wind direction, fighter approach angle, split-second timing, mechanical reliability — and he would have been among the 47,000 American airmen who died in those aircraft. He knew it. He never forgot it. And he honored that knowledge by refusing to glorify his survival or diminish the cost of those who didn't make it home. That humility, that refusal to celebrate survival as personal triumph rather than fortunate outcome, characterized many of the best combat veterans. They knew what they'd done. They knew it had mattered. But they also knew that claiming credit for survival diminished everyone who died doing the same things they'd done. So they kept quiet, carried their experiences privately, and let the historical record speak for itself without embellishment. The record speaks clearly. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, 392nd Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, 40 combat missions, 22 confirmed kills, Distinguished Service Cross, survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, lived quietly, died in 1988. The facts are simple and insufficient. They tell you what he did, but not what it cost or how he carried it. The fuller story, the one his family saw and his crew remembered and his wife witnessed across 4 decades, fills in those gaps. But even that story is incomplete. The full cost of his service, the complete accounting of what those missions took from him, and what he learned about himself and human nature in the process, that died with him. All we have are fragments, the counting, the nightmares Eleanor mentioned, the long silences, the refusal to discuss it, fragments that suggest a whole we can't fully reconstruct. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some experiences are too individual, too specific to be fully conveyed. War changes people in ways that resist easy articulation. The man who climbed into Devil's Daughter for 40 missions wasn't the same man who climbed out after the 40th. The changes were profound and permanent. Understanding what those changes cost requires understanding what he carried, and what he carried was his alone to bear. The historical record can preserve the facts. Museums can display the artifacts. Historians can analyze the tactics. But the lived experience, the felt sense of what it meant to be that person in that situation, dies with the person. We're left with approximations, with narratives that gesture toward truth without fully capturing it. That's the limitation of history. It can record what happened. It struggles to convey what it meant. What we can say with certainty is that Michael Aruth served his country in one of the most dangerous military assignments of World War II. He performed at a level that exceeded expectations and redefined what was possible in defensive air combat. He survived when most didn't. He carried the cost of that survival without complaint for the rest of his life. And he died having contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany, while preserving the lives of the men who flew with him. That's enough. It doesn't need embellishment or dramatization. The simple facts of his service, properly understood, contain all the meaning necessary. He was there. He did what needed doing. He paid the price. That's the story of every combat veteran, simplified to its essence. The specific details vary, but the core truth remains constant across all wars, all eras, all combatants. They were there, they did what needed doing, and they paid the price. The cost of remembering them, of preserving their stories, of ensuring that what they experienced isn't forgotten, that's on us. The generation that fought World War II is almost gone. The direct memories, the first-hand accounts, the living witnesses to what they endured, soon none will remain. What we preserve now, what we record and archive and pass forward, is all that will survive of their experience. Michael Aruth's story survives in museum exhibits and archived records and the memories of families who knew him. It survives in tactical studies and doctrinal documents that reference his techniques without naming him. It survives in the oral histories of veterans who flew with him and remembered what it meant to serve alongside someone who made survival seem possible. And now it survives in this account, another attempt to capture what can be captured and acknowledge what can't. He aimed where death lived. He fired into empty sky and killed the fighters that flew through it. He survived 40 missions when survival was improbable. He came home and lived with what he'd done for 43 years. He counted his dead and never stopped counting. And when he died, he left behind a record of service that represents the best and the cost of what his generation gave to defeat fascism and preserve freedom. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what we remember when we remember Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth. Not just the 11 minutes over Bremen, though those were remarkable. Not just the 22 kills, though those mattered tactically. But the entire arc of service and sacrifice and the decades of carrying the cost. All of it, complete and undiminished. Preserved so that future generations might understand what was done and what it cost and why it mattered. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten.